Did you know that every war has one thing in common? It's not about land, freedom, or even power. It's about something far darker, something no one wants you to know.
To the rear with supplies that have been painstakingly accumulated and
What if I told you that every conflict, every battle, every drop of blood spilt was part of a hidden agenda? And what if that agenda is still controlling the world today? Stick around, because this is the story they don't want you to hear. War is one of the oldest and most destructive forces in human history. From the ancient battles of Rome to the modern conflicts in the Middle East, war has shaped nations, toppled empires, and rewritten the course of history. But here's the thing. What if everything you've been told about war is a lie? What if the reasons we're given, freedom, justice, security, are just a cover for something much bigger? Today, we're diving deep into the hidden agendas behind every war. We'll explore the real motives, the players pulling the strings, and the shocking truths buried for centuries. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about the present and the future. So let's get started. Think about the last war you learned about in school. It could be World War I, II, or even the Vietnam War. What was the reason given for why it started? For World War I, it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. For World War II, it was Hitler's invasion of Poland. But here's the question. Were those the real reasons? Or were they just the spark that lit a fire already waiting to burn? The truth is that wars are rarely about what they seem. Behind every conflict, there's a hidden agenda. Sometimes it's about money. Sometimes it's about resources. Sometimes it's about power. But one thing is sure. The people who start wars are rarely the ones who fight them, and the people who benefit from wars are seldom the ones who suffer. So what's going on? Who's pulling the strings? And why do we keep falling for the same lies repeatedly? The ancient wars. Power and control. Let's start at the beginning. Ancient wars were often fought over territory, resources, or religion. But even then, there was always a hidden agenda. Take the Roman Empire, for example. They didn't conquer half the world just to spread civilization. They did it for power, for wealth, and control. The same goes for the Crusades. On the surface, they were about reclaiming the Holy Land, but dig deeper, and you'll find that they were also about expanding influence, controlling trade routes, and filling the coffers of the church. The lesson here is simple. Even in ancient times, wars were never just about what they seemed. There was always something more going on behind the scenes. The world wars, money, and resources. When we think about the world wars, we often picture heroic soldiers, epic battles, and the fight for freedom. But behind the scenes, there was something far more calculating at play. Money, resources, and power were the real drivers of the conflicts that shaped the 20th century. Let's break it down. World War I, the war that wasn't about war. World War I is often remembered as the war that started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. But that assassination was just the spark. The real reasons for the war were buried much more profound. At the time, Europe was a powder keg waiting to explode. Countries were competing for colonies, resources, and influence. The British Empire was the dominant global power, but Germany rose quickly. They wanted their place in the sun, as Kaiser Wilhelm II said. And that meant challenging Britain's control over trade routes, markets, and raw materials. But it wasn't just about national pride, it was about money. The arms race leading up to the war was a massive industry. Countries built battleships, stockpiled weapons, and expanded their armies. And who was paying for all of this? The banks. Banks like J.P. Morgan and Company in the United States lent vast sums of money to European powers, financing the war before it started. They made even more money when the war broke out by funding both sides. It was a business, plain and simple. Then there were the resources. Europe was hungry for raw materials like coal, iron, and rubber to fuel their industries. African and Asian colonies were seen as treasure chests waiting to be looted. The competition for these resources was fierce, creating tensions that made war almost inevitable. But here's the kicker. The people who started the war weren't the ones who fought it. The generals, politicians, and bankers were all safe in their offices and mansions. It was the ordinary soldiers who paid the price. Millions of them died in the trenches, while the people who sent them there counted their profits. The Treaty of Versailles, a recipe for disaster. When World War I finally ended in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it laid the groundwork for another war. The treaty imposed harsh penalties on Germany. They were forced to pay reparations, give up territory, and limit their military. But here's the problem. Those penalties weakened Germany's economy. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment soared, and people were desperate. This created the perfect conditions for someone like Adolf Hitler to rise to power. He promised to restore Germany's glory, and people were willing to listen. But what they didn't realize was that Hitler's ambitions would plunge the world into another, even deadlier war. World War II, the war for resources. World War II is often framed as a fight against tyranny, and it was, but it was also about something much more tangible: resources. Take oil, for example. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare. Tanks, planes, ships, they all ran on it. Control of oil fields was a primary strategic goal for both the Axis and Allied powers. When Japan invaded Southeast Asia, it wasn't just about expanding its empire. It was also about securing access to rubber, tin, and oil. The U.S. embargo on oil exports to Japan was one of the key factors that pushed Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. Similarly, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just about ideology, it was about resources. Hitler wanted the oil fields of the Caucasus and the wheat fields of Ukraine. Without those resources, Germany couldn't sustain its war effort. But it wasn't just the Axis powers who were after resources. The Allies were too. The US and Britain were determined to control the Middle East oil fields. They knew that whoever controlled the oil would control the post-war world. The military-industrial complex, World War II, also marked the rise of the military-industrial complex, an alliance between governments, arms manufacturers, and other industries that profited from war. Companies like General Motors, Ford, and Boeing shifted their production to support the war effort. They built tanks, planes, and ships on an unprecedented scale, and they made a fortune doing it. But here's the thing, these companies didn't want to lose their profits once the war ended. They needed a new enemy to justify their existence. And that's where the Cold War came in, the hidden costs of war. While the elites counted their money, ordinary people paid the price. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, with an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths. Entire cities were destroyed, and millions of people were left homeless. But the cost didn't end when the war did. The psychological scars lasted for generations. Families were torn apart, economies shattered, and the world was divided. Yet the people who started the war, the politicians, the bankers, the industrialists, came out on top. They made money gain power and shaped the post-war world to their advantage. The bigger picture. So what's the lesson here? It's that war is never just about what they tell you. It's not about freedom or justice or security. It's about money. It's about resources. It's about power. The scary part is that this pattern hasn't changed. The same forces are in the world wars and today's conflicts. The names and faces may differ, but the game is the same. The question is, how long are we going to keep playing it? The Cold War, ideology and influence. Speaking of the Cold War, this was a conflict that wasn't fought with tanks and planes, but with spies, propaganda, and proxy wars. On the surface, it was about capitalism versus communism, but the hidden agenda was all about influence. The US and the Soviet Union were fighting for control of the world. They backed opposing sides in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan, not because they cared about those countries, but because they wanted to expand their power. And let's not forget about the military-industrial complex. Wars are big business, and someone was making a lot of money. Modern wars. Oil, money, and power. When we talk about modern wars, the first thing that comes to mind is the Middle East. The region has been a hotspot for conflict for decades, and the reasons are always framed in terms of freedom, democracy, or security. But digging deeper, you'll find that the real motives are far more cynical. It's about oil, money, and power. Let's start with the most obvious example, the Iraq War. The Iraq War, a war for oil? In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official reason was to disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and to end Saddam Hussein's regime, which was accused of supporting terrorism. But here's the thing, no WMDs were ever found. So what was the real reason? Many experts believe it was about oil. Iraq has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and controlling those reserves would give the US a significant advantage in the global economy. But it's not just about the oil itself. It's about control. By securing Iraq's oil fields, the US could influence global oil prices, weaken rival powers, and ensure American companies had access to cheap oil. And let's not forget about the contracts. After the invasion, US companies like Halliburton and Bechtel were awarded billions of dollars in contracts to rebuild Iraq's infrastructure. It was a gold rush for the military-industrial complex. But while the elites were making money, the people of Iraq were paying the price. The war led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, displaced millions more, and left the country in chaos. And for what? Oil, money, power. Afghanistan, the forever war. The war in Afghanistan is another example. It started in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. But 20 years later, the US was still there. Why? Part of the reason is strategic. Afghanistan is located at the crossroads of Central Asia, making it a key piece in the geopolitical chessboard. Control Afghanistan, and you can influence the surrounding regions, including Iran, China, and Russia. But there's also the issue of resources. Afghanistan is rich in minerals like lithium, copper, and rare earth elements, essential for modern technology. The U.S. Geological Survey estimated that Afghanistan's mineral wealth could be worth over $1 trillion. And then there's the opium. Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of opium, which is used to make heroin. The drug trade has fueled corruption, funded insurgents, and created a cycle of violence that's hard to break. But again, the real winners are the people who profit from war. Arms manufacturers, private military contractors, and other industries that depend on conflict have made billions from the war in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Afghan people have suffered immensely. Yemen, the forgotten war. The war in Yemen is another example of a modern conflict driven by hidden agendas. It started in 2014 when Houthi rebels overthrew the government. But it quickly escalated into a regional proxy war, with Saudi Arabia leading a coalition against the Houthis and Iran supporting them. On the surface, it's a sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, but the real reasons are far more complex. For Saudi Arabia, it's about maintaining dominance in the region. Yemen is located at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula and controls access to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Control Yemen and you can control a key shipping route for oil and other goods. For Iran, it's about expanding its influence. By supporting the Houthis, Iran can challenge Saudi Arabia's dominance and create a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula, but it's also about resources. Yemen has significant oil and gas reserves, particularly in the southern part of the country. Controlling those resources can weaken your rivals and strengthen your economy. And then there's the humanitarian cost. The war in Yemen has led to one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, with millions of people facing famine, disease, and displacement. The role of corporations. One of the most disturbing aspects of modern wars is the role of corporations. From arms manufacturers to private military contractors, entire industries depend on war. Take Lockheed Martin, for example. It's one of the largest defense contractors in the world, producing everything from fighter jets to missiles. In 2020, it reported revenues of over $65 billion. And where does that money come from? Government contracts. Private military contractors like Blackwater, now known as Academy, have profited immensely from modern wars. They provide everything from security to logistics, often operating in the shadows with little oversight. But it's not just about the money, it's about influence. These corporations have close ties to governments and often lobby for policies that benefit their bottom line. In some cases, they even shape the narrative around war, pushing for conflicts that will generate profits. The human cost. While the elites count their money, ordinary people pay the price. Modern wars have led to the deaths of millions of people, displaced countless more, and left entire regions in ruins. But the costs don't end when the fighting stops. The psychological scars last for generations. Families are torn apart, economies are shattered, and societies are left divided. Yet the people who start these wars, the politicians, the bankers, the industrialists, come out on top. They make money, gain power, and shape the world to their advantage. War is one of human history's most complex and destructive forces, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. Behind every conflict, there's a hidden agenda. Whether ancient empires fight for control, world powers battle for resources, or modern governments use fear to maintain power, the real motives are rarely what they seem. But by understanding these hidden agendas, we can see the world more clearly, question the stories we're told, and work towards a future where war is no longer the answer. Because the truth is, war doesn't just destroy lives, it destroys our humanity. And that's something we can't afford to lose. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that subscribe button. There's much more to uncover. I don't want you to miss it.